What happens when someone who believes they are untouchable crosses the wrong person? I asked myself that very question the moment I saw the bright yellow notice nailed to the wooden fence of my property. The sight of it was like an itch I couldn't scratch, a quiet but deliberate act of war. The Homeowners Association had finally overstepped. Again, but this time, they'd made a mistake, one that I wasn't about to let slide. Immediate removal of unauthorized livestock, it read. I took my time, my fingers tracing the paper, feeling the weight of the words. My cows have been grazing on this land for years, long before the HOA had even been formed. This wasn't a simple case of misplaced authority. This was theft disguised as regulation. And the signature at the bottom confirmed my suspicion. Karen Delacroix, the self-anointed queen of the HOA, had orchestrated this power move. Karen wasn't just any HOA president. She ruled with an iron fist and a gavel, imposing fines on neighbors for mailbox styles, driveway cracks, and the audacity of having a garden hose visible from the street. But this, taking my livestock, this was a declaration of war. I sighed, folding the notice with precision, my mind already weaving through the legal avenues. I needed to act fast, but first, I had to check on my cattle. I was on the other side of my farm, inside the feeding shed, tending to one of my cows that had just given birth. The calf was weak, its legs trembling as it tried to stand. I wiped my brow, focusing on the delicate process of ensuring it latched onto its mother for milk. Then I heard it, the rapid crunch of boots against the dirt, coming straight for me. One of my farm hands, Davis, sprinted down the path, waving his arms frantically. Boss, you gotta come quick, he panted, barely able to catch his breath. They're taking the cows. Karen's people, trucks, officers. She brought a whole crew. I stiffened, the air turning electric with adrenaline. I grabbed my hat and rushed toward the main pasture, my boots kicking up dust. The farm was large, massive, actually, but the distance between me and the main grazing area had never felt this long. My heart hammered in my chest as I closed the gap, Davis struggling to keep up beside me. By the time I reached the pasture, it was too late. The cows were gone. I came to a halt, my hands clenching into fists at my sides as I took in the scene before me. Tire tracks scarred the earth where the transport trucks had come and gone. My cattle, my property, had been stolen right from under my nose. They moved fast, Davis muttered, his voice filled with disbelief. I tried to stop him, but they had papers, some kind of legal-looking thing. HOA officials were out here, barking orders like they owned the place. I exhaled slowly, staring at the empty pasture. Karen, she thought she had won. That was her first mistake. I turned on my heel, my mind already shifting into strategy mode. Karen Delacroix didn't realize it yet, but she had just picked a fight with the wrong man, and I had every intention of making her regret it. Karen had made her move. She had played her hand boldly, recklessly even, but I wasn't about to respond in kind. No, that would be too predictable, too easy. She expected outrage, demands, threats, something she could twist against me. But I had learned long ago that the best counterattack was one that was never seen coming. So I did nothing, at least nothing she could see. By the time the sun rose the next morning, my farm looked deceptively peaceful. The pasture, now empty, bore the scars of tire tracks, a brutal reminder of Karen's audacity. My workers were uneasy, whispering about what had happened, waiting for me to unleash my fury. But I remained calm, methodical. Davis, my most trusted farmhand, stood near the barn, arms crossed, waiting for direction. So what's the plan, boss? He asked carefully. I exhaled, brushing dust from my sleeves. We observe. His brow furrowed. That's it. For now. That was the beauty of patience. It made people nervous. It left them wondering what came next. And Karen? She would be wondering the most. I spent the next few days doing what Karen never expected, acting as if nothing had happened. I worked the land, maintained the fences, handled my affairs as though my livestock hadn't been ripped from under me. But in the background, I was moving pieces into place. First, I paid a visit to the county records office. I had all my legal documents, of course, but I wanted more than just proof of ownership. I wanted Karen's history. Any discrepancies, any old disputes, anything that might tell me who exactly I was dealing with. What I found didn't surprise me. Karen had a long record of overstepping. Numerous complaints had been filed against her HOA leadership, most settled quietly before they could escalate. Fines, aggressive property seizures, even an incident where she tried to have someone's guest house demolished because it didn't align with community aesthetics. But the most interesting detail, she had lost before. A single case buried under years of quiet settlements. A land dispute with another homeowner. And that case had something valuable, a precedent. The second step was quieter, but just as important. I needed to know where my cows were. I didn't go searching myself. That would have been too obvious. Instead, I had Davis and a few other workers keep an ear to the ground. HOA board members talked. Workers who were hired to remove my livestock talked. And within days, I had my answer. Karen hadn't moved the cows far. They were being held on a separate property, one that she had borrowed from a friend under the guise of an HOA action. That was all I needed to know. The last piece of the puzzle was timing. I waited. I let Karen settle into the idea that she had won, that I had accepted defeat. The HOA meetings went on, as usual. The neighborhood gossiped about the livestock violation as if it were a closed case. Karen walked around with that insufferable smirk, believing she had cemented her control. I let her think that, because when I finally moved, it wouldn't be a counterpunch, it would be a checkmate. By the third day, the air around my property felt thick, charged with the tension of an inevitable storm. It wasn't just the cows that had been taken. It seemed like the battle for my farm had shifted into a whole new level of absurdity. The knock on my door came earlier than usual that morning, and there she was. Karen Delacroix, with that self-satisfied grin plastered on her face, holding a thick envelope in her hand. Behind her, I noticed two uniformed officers standing at a distance, their eyes scanning my property as if they were expecting a riot. "Mr. Williams," Karen said with a tilt of her head, "I'm afraid you've missed an important deadline. This is your final notice." I didn't flinch, though the weight of what she was holding was far heavier than it appeared. She handed me the envelope with a flourish, and I opened it slowly. It was a fine, not just any fine, a fine for failure to comply, a demurrage charge, and on top of that, a weekly usage fee for the space my livestock had occupied in her jurisdiction. She had taken my cows, and now she was charging me $1,000 a week for storing them in her impromptu facility. I stared at the numbers, the red ink screaming across the page. $1,000 weekly. I muttered, the irony not lost on me. She had stolen my property, and now I was supposed to pay her for the privilege of having my livestock imprisoned in her care. And that's not all, Karen said with a glimmer in her eye. There are additional fees for the inconvenience caused, damages to HOA property, and the handling of your animals. She smiled, her voice sweet but laced with venom. It's all very standard. I trust you'll pay promptly. Karen, I said, keeping my voice calm, but with an edge that made her pause. You're charging me for what? You took my cows. And now, you're charging me for what exactly? For the privilege of having my property stolen. Her smile didn't falter. I'm just doing my job. You've been given ample notice. If you don't settle this, we'll have no choice but to escalate the matter. I almost laughed. Almost. Because I knew she was bluffing, but I also knew how far she would go to make this difficult. As far as I could see, Karen had no idea who she was dealing with. I took a deep breath, letting the silence stretch between us before responding. Fine, I said, my voice still even. I'll pay for the next week. You can consider this temporary compliance. But understand this, Karen, you're crossing a line here. I won't be bullied into paying these ludicrous fees forever. Karen's smirk flickered, but she didn't press further. Glad to hear it, she said. I'll expect the first payment by Friday. And don't forget, this is just the beginning. If you don't act fast, things will get much worse. As she turned to leave, I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. She wasn't done. This wasn't over. But I wasn't worried, because I had a plan, and it was already in motion. 2 weeks passed since I'd reluctantly paid Karen's absurd fines, each one more egregious than the last. Every time I handed over that check, I felt the sting of her manipulation, Yet in the back of my mind, I knew it was part of the game. I could afford it for now, but the end of this charade was near. The real advantage came the moment my wife, Evelyn, returned from her vacation in Italy. She was a legal practitioner, and I needed her expertise more than ever. She had a way of seeing through the chaos, of cutting through legal jargon with surgical precision. I briefed her as soon as she set foot on the tarmac. "Karen's pushing her luck," I said, pacing the living room while she unpacked. "She thinks she can take my cows, find me into oblivion, and just walk away." Evelyn smiled, unfazed by the gravity of the situation. "And what's your next move?" I hesitated. "We need to move carefully. I've got a feeling she's about to escalate this, but we can't act too soon. We need to let her think she's still in control." She raised an eyebrow. "The waiting game. You're letting her make the first mistake, aren't you?" "Exactly," I replied, my lips curling into a calculated smile. "It's a game of patience. She thinks she's winning, but she doesn't know what's coming." The days dragged on, each one adding a new layer to the tension. Karen continued to flaunt her authority, sending threatening letters and reminders about the fines. She even had the audacity to show up at my house once, expecting me to sign an agreement that would essentially make me her financial prisoner. I ignored her. No one would rush me into a corner. But it wasn't just Karen who was playing her part in this charade. One afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor, a lawyer from Karen's side. He was a young man, freshly pressed suit, sharp tie, the whole works. He walked up to my front door like he was on a mission, carrying a briefcase that looked too important for his age. "I'm here on behalf of the Homeowners Association," he said, his voice oozing professionalism. "Mr. Williams, this is a formal notification of intent to file legal action regarding your failure to comply with the imposed fines and regulations." I raised an eyebrow, casually leaning against the doorframe. "Really? I thought the HOA already made their move by taking my cows. Now you're here to offer me another fine? I must be a high roller in your books." He faltered for a moment, but recovered quickly. "This is not a joke, Mr. Williams. If you don't pay the remaining fines within the next 48 hours, further action will be taken, including legal penalties. Consider this your last warning." I closed the door gently in his face, not before telling him, "Tell Karen her game is about to be up. You might want to advise her to stop while she's ahead." Later that evening, Evelyn and I sat down to discuss our next move over a glass of wine. As always, her sharp legal mind was in full force, and we planned our strategy to make sure we were one step ahead. "I've been thinking," she said, swirling the wine in her glass. "Karen's bluffing, but she's not as smart as she thinks. You've been handing her small victories, but now it's time to turn the tables." I listened intently as she outlined a few key tactics, each one more methodical than the last. "We'll need to get the zoning board involved, but in a way that Karen doesn't see coming. We'll also need to escalate the legal pressure on her, but slowly, make her feel the walls closing in without giving her the satisfaction of a confrontation. She's used to people caving to her. We'll make her question everything she thought she knew." I smiled. "You're right. It's time to start pulling the strings." The following days brought more of the same. Karen's increasingly desperate moves, her letters, her threats. But Evelyn and I stayed calm, watching, planning. Each move Karen made was another misstep, another inch closer to exposing her overreach. And then came the day of the next HOA meeting. I knew this would be the moment she'd been preparing for. Karen was no fool. She'd expect me to show up and try to fight back publicly, but that would be a mistake. This time, I wouldn't just walk in and present my documents like before. No, this time, I was going to make sure Karen's game unraveled in front of everyone. When the meeting finally started, Karen stood at the front, smug as ever, her eyes glinting with a sense of victory. She had her notes in hand, ready to present her case against me. But she wasn't the one in control anymore. I let her finish her opening remarks, her voice carrying over the room like a victory speech, before I stood slowly, drawing the attention of the entire room. The other board members fell silent, sensing something was about to shift. "Before you continue, Karen," I said, my voice steady and calm, "I have a few things I'd like to share." The room grew still as I walked forward, each step deliberate, measured. I held in my hand the next piece of the puzzle. The real game was about to begin. The night before the HOA meeting, I couldn't sleep. The events of the last few weeks had brought us to this precipice. One final step that would either end this battle or open the door to an even bigger war. But the thing about war is, it's all about timing. And the time had come. Karen's actions had been reckless, far more than I'd ever anticipated. She had underestimated me. Her smug confidence, her disregard for the law, and most importantly, her belief that she could manipulate the system without consequences. All of it had led her straight into my trap. The game had been played on my terms, but it was now time to unveil the truth. The moment I walked into the HOA meeting that day, I had every document in hand, every detail clear in my mind, and a strategy so meticulous it could have been drafted in court. I wasn't going to storm in yelling accusations. No, this was about a measured, cold dissection of Karen's every wrong move. I started by detailing the first mistake Karen made, the livestock removal incident. On May 3rd, I was on the far side of my farm, feeding my newly delivered cows when I received an urgent report from one of my workers. The HOA team had arrived, and they were already in the process of trying to take my cows. The workers had been approached by the HOA team, who presented what was claimed to be legal documentation. However, I have never seen these papers, nor was I shown any proof that would validate their authority to remove my livestock. I calmly explained. At 8:30 a.m., the truck arrived on my property. My workers asked for the proper documentation, but there was none. They only presented an HOA directive, which, as any competent legal professional would know, is not the same as a court order. The room was silent, the board members waiting for me to continue. But I wasn't done. Despite my workers' efforts to reach me and inform them that I was on my way, Karen's agents proceeded to take my cows without my consent. By the time I arrived at the property, they had already removed them. They insisted that the cows would only be returned once I complied with her demands. This was the first time Karen attempted to hold my property hostage without any legal foundation. It was a blatant overreach, one that she later tried to cover up with fines and false threats. At this point, I could see Karen beginning to shift uncomfortably in her seat, trying to hold on to that cool facade, but it was slipping. I wasn't acting impulsively. Everything I had done, or rather, hadn't done, had been with precision. Why didn't I act sooner, you might ask? Why didn't I take her head on in those first few days? The truth was simple. I knew she'd make a mistake. People like Karen always do. I didn't need to escalate things quickly, and I didn't want to get caught up in petty legal battles over a few fines. I wanted something bigger. I wanted evidence. I needed to show her that it wasn't just about my cows. It was about her entire strategy of manipulation and abuse of power. As the tension built in the room, I leaned forward slightly, preparing to drop the hammer. The next piece of evidence was more damning than anything Karen could have anticipated. Let's move on to the second issue, I said, and reached for the next set of papers. After you took my cows on May 3rd, Karen issued a fine for failure to comply with HOA regulations on May 10th. She claimed I owed damages and that my livestock were occupying HOA-controlled space. However, my property is classified as agricultural land under county zoning laws, and the HOA has no jurisdiction over agricultural land, as confirmed by the county zoning board on May 12th. I paused, letting the weight of the date sink in. Karen, you were fully aware of this, weren't you? I continued, my voice steady. And yet you pushed forward with fines, coercing me into paying $1,000 every week for something that was never under your authority. At no point did you ever provide proper documentation or a court order. Karen's face flushed a shade of red I hadn't seen in years. But she wasn't going to go down quietly. She stood up abruptly, her voice shaking, trying to recover. The HOA has regulations that are enforced for the safety and well-being of all residents, she said, fumbling with the papers in front of her. This situation is an isolated case, and if Mr. Williams had just complied, none of this would have happened. The fines are valid, and I will not back down from enforcing them. But this wasn't just about the cows anymore. This was about holding Karen accountable for years of illegal practices. I let her speak, knowing full well that the truth was already in motion. I had quietly been gathering information about Karen's other overreach incidents. The infamous mailbox incident, where she had unlawfully removed a perfectly legal mailbox from a neighbor's property in the dead of night. The fines she had imposed for things like lawn colors and even the angle of driveway lights. These were all part of her reign of terror. "Karen," I said, my voice now cutting through the noise of her excuses, "this isn't an isolated incident. You've been issuing fines and threatening legal action against homeowners outside the scope of your authority for years. Your actions have caused irreparable damage to the community." I pulled out the final piece of the puzzle. Here's what the county board had to say. After reviewing my case, they decided to launch an audit of your practices. The audit is set to begin next month, and I'm sure you can already imagine the fallout from that. At that moment, Karen's world came crashing down. The room turned completely still as the full weight of the situation hit her. She realized she couldn't bluff her way through anymore. Her reputation was already damaged, and now the HOA's practices were being scrutinized by the county. "Enough," she finally muttered, her voice strained. "I rescind the order for removal. The fines will be reviewed." But the damage had already been done. The board members no longer saw her as the authoritative figure they once did. She had lost control, not just of my case, but of her entire position. The next week, I received a formal letter from the HOA. Karen had rescinded the livestock removal order, and the fines were dropped, just as I had expected. The county board continued with its audit, uncovering a trail of overreach that extended far beyond just my property. Karen resigned shortly thereafter. Her reputation was in shambles, and residents now knew they could fight back. As for me, my cows were back where they belonged. I had played the long game, and it paid off. Karen learned the hard way that power unchecked is power lost. And I learned that sometimes the best way to win is to remain silent until the right moment to strike arrives. The game was over, and I had won. Power unchecked is power lost. And Karen learned that the hard way. She thought she could bend the rules, manipulate the system, and walk away unchallenged. But when you play games with the wrong person, the consequences are inevitable. Have you ever dealt with an HOA nightmare, a power-hungry official, or someone who thought they were untouchable? Share your experience in the comments. Let's talk about it. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and follow for more jaw-dropping real-life battles.